An orphaned, mangy bull calf collapsed in a ditch, so weak he was just skin and bone in the freezing cold. The world had already given him up for dead. When an old farmer found him, every voice of reason said to just keep driving. The calf was too sick, too far gone. Saving him would be impossible. But this wasn't just a sad accident. It was an act of cruelty. And the farmer would soon discover a heartbreaking secret about why this tiny animal was left to die, a secret that would pit one man against the world, forcing him to make a choice that could cost him everything. When a life has been thrown away like trash, what does it take to prove its true worth? Subscribe if you want to know what will happen to the forgotten calf. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The January cold was a bitter, personal thing. It didn't just settle on the land. It worked its way into a man's bones, making him feel every one of his 68 years. Earl Jenkins felt it in his knuckles, clenched tight around the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup. The truck's heater wheezed a pathetic stream of lukewarm air that did little to fight the frost creeping across the inside of the windshield. He was on the back road, the one that skirted the edge of what used to be Miller's big dairy farm, heading toward town for the few groceries he needed to get through the week. Life had become a series of these small, necessary trips, markers in a quiet calendar of solitude. Ever since Martha passed, the farm had grown quiet too. He'd sold off the last of his cattle 5 years back, unable to look at a herd without seeing her standing by the fence, her hand resting on the top rail, a smile on her face that could warm a man better than any summer sun. Now, the fences were just there to frame empty fields, and the big red barn stood more as a monument than a workplace. He was driving past the long, sloping ditch that ran alongside the road when a shape caught his eye. Just a dark lump against the gray-white snow, easy to mistake for a discarded tire or a bundle of frozen rags. But then it moved. A small, almost imperceptible twitch. Earl slowed the truck to a crawl, his brow furrowed. No animal with any sense would be lying in a ditch on a day like this. He pulled over, the truck's tires crunching on the icy shoulder, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was vast, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. He sat there for a long moment, a war waging inside him. Part of him, the practical, frugal part that had run a farm for 40 years, told him to just drive on. Trouble in a ditch was trouble you didn't need. But another part of him, a part that wore Martha's face, wouldn't let him. "You'd better at least look, Earl," he could almost hear her say. "What if it's one of God's creatures in need?" With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, he pushed the door open and stepped out. He made his way carefully down the slick embankment, his boots sinking into the snow. As he got closer, the lump took form, and what he saw made his heart ache with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a calf, or what was left of one. Its coat was a mess of mange and mud, stretched so tight over its tiny frame that every rib and knob of its spine stood out in sharp relief. Its eyes, when they blinked open, were as dull and lifeless as muddy water. There was no sign of its mother, no tracks but its own desperate, scuffed trail leading from the road before it had collapsed. It was an orphan, cast off and left to the elements. Earl stood over the little creature, a statue of worn denim and quiet grief. He knew what the world would expect him to do. The right thing, the rancher's thing, was to end its suffering. It was a mercy, they'd say, a kindness. But all he could see was Martha, her hands gentle as she'd set a splint on a blue jay's broken wing, the time she'd spent a whole week nursing a runt piglet that everyone else had written off. She saw value where others saw none, and looking down at this pathetic heap of life, Earl felt a stirring of that same stubborn compassion. It felt like a betrayal to her memory to just walk away. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and laid a calloused hand on the calf's neck. The hide was icy cold, but beneath it, a faint, thready pulse fluttered against his palm. A fighter. He muttered the words to the empty sky, to the memory of his wife, to whatever part of him was still listening. "Lord, help me." He climbed back to the truck, retrieved an old horse blanket from the toolbox in the bed, and went back down. The calf was too weak to struggle as he wrapped it up, a bundle of bones that weighed next to nothing. He carried it up to the truck and laid it gently on the floor of the passenger side, cranking the heat up as high as it would go. Just for the night, he told himself, the words feeling thin and dishonest even as he said them, just to get you warm. Back at the farm, he carried the calf into the cavernous barn. The air inside was still and thick with the ghosts of hay and livestock. He set up a makeshift pen in an old folding stall, laying down a deep bed of clean straw. He then went to the house and mixed up a bottle of warm milk replacer, his hands moving with an old, familiar rhythm he thought he'd forgotten. The calf was too weak to suckle at first. Earl had to gently pry its mouth open and squeeze a few drops onto its tongue. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, a flicker. The calf's tongue moved, a slow, tentative lick. Its ears twitched. Earl kept at it, patient and slow, until the little animal was taking weak but steady pulls from the bottle. As it drank, a tiny spark of life seemed to return to its dull eyes. Earl watched it, a feeling he couldn't name swelling in his chest. He looked at the creature's matted coat and homeless state. "Well, you're a little hobo, aren't you?" he said softly. "Just a wanderer." The name stuck. Hobo. It felt right. The next morning he called Dr. Raymond, the town vet. Alice was a brisk, no-nonsense woman who had known Earl and Martha for 30 years. She took one look at Hobo, and her face grew serious. She listened to his lungs, checked his gums, and shook her head. "Earl, this is bad," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He's severely malnourished, has a nasty case of pneumonia starting, and from the looks of this coat, he's riddled with parasites. The odds are not in his favor." She told him what it would take: antibiotics, vitamins, special feed. The cost she quoted made Earl's stomach clench. It was more money than he'd spent on anything but property taxes in years. It was money he didn't really have. He looked at Hobo, who had curled into a tight ball in the straw, and then he looked at Alice's waiting eyes. The practical man in him screamed that it was foolish, a waste of good money on a lost cause. But the man who missed his wife, the man who had felt that flicker of life against his palm, couldn't say no. "Do what you have to, Alice," he heard himself say, his voice raspy. "We'll give him a fighting chance." That night, long after Dr. Raymond had left and the world outside had gone dark and silent, Earl stood alone in the barn. The only sounds were the wind groaning against the old wood and the shallow, ragged breathing coming from the stall. He watched the soft rise and fall of Hobo's bony side, a fragile rhythm in the vast, empty space. He had told himself it was just for one night, but he knew now, standing there in the cold, that it wasn't true. This wasn't just about a calf anymore. This small, forgotten life had stumbled into his, and its fight had now become his fight. For the first time in a long time, the silence of the barn didn't feel empty. It felt like a vigil. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one that felt both new and ancient. The quiet of Earl's life was replaced by the demands of another's. Long before the sun thought about rising, he'd be out in the barn, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the cold darkness, checking on Hobo. He'd warm the milk replacer on the old hot plate in his workshop, his hands, once stiff and hesitant, now moving with a sureness he hadn't felt in years. He'd coax the calf to drink, then spend time rubbing its mangy hide with a soft cloth, trying to stimulate blood flow and bring some warmth back to the skin. This small, fragile life depended on him entirely, and in that dependence, Earl found a sense of purpose that had been dormant for half a decade. The barn was no longer a tomb of memories. It was a nursery, a sanctuary, a place where the future was being fought for one shallow breath at a time. The change in him was as gradual and steady as the calf's slow return to health. He started spending more time outdoors, not just shuffling from the house to the truck, but actually working. He patched a few loose boards on the barn wall, cleaned out a water trough that had been dry for years, his movements slow but deliberate. His neighbors noticed. When he went to the feed store, he no longer just nodded and left. He'd linger by the counter, talking to Bill, the owner, about the quality of the new hay shipment. "Heard you took in a stray," Bill said one afternoon, leaning on the counter. Earl just grunted. Just a little fella. Found him in a ditch. But there was a softness in his eyes that wasn't there before. Folks started seeing his truck parked outside the diner for breakfast again, a Saturday morning ritual he'd abandoned after Martha died. He was rejoining the world, one hesitant step at a time, pulled back by the needs of a creature that had nothing to give but its own will to live. One crisp afternoon, a boy appeared at the edge of the open barn door, a shadow in the bright light. He was maybe 10 years old, with quiet eyes, and a way of holding himself that seemed older than his years. It was Tommy, the Miller boy, who lived down the road. His father had passed a couple of years back, and his mother worked long hours at the hospital, leaving the boy with a lot of time to himself. "Heard you got a calf?" Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. Earl, who was kneeling in the straw beside Hobo, looked up. He wasn't used to visitors, especially young ones. "Just a little bull calf," Earl replied, his tone gruff but not unkind. "He's been sick." Tommy took a tentative step inside, his gaze fixed on the small animal. He didn't see the patches of missing fur or the bony frame. He saw a calf. Can I see him?" he asked. Earl watched the boy for a moment, saw the genuine, gentle curiosity in his face, and nodded. Tommy approached slowly, kneeling down a few feet away, not wanting to spook the little creature. "What's his name?" "Hobo." Tommy smiled, a real bright smile that lit up his face. "That's a good name." From that day on, Tommy became a regular visitor. He'd show up after school, quiet as a mouse, and just sit in the straw, sometimes talking to Hobo in a low murmur, sometimes just watching. He seemed to understand that the calf needed peace, and his calm presence was a balm to both the animal and the old man. Weeks turned into a month, and under Earl's constant care, a miracle began to unfold. A fine layer of new hair started to cover the bare patches on Hobo's skin. He was gaining weight, the sharp edges of his bones softening into the gentle curves of a healthy calf. The day came when Earl was rubbing him down, and Hobo, with a sudden surge of strength, pushed against his hands and tried to get his legs under him. He was wobbly, his spindly legs trembling like new leaves in a breeze. He struggled, fell back into the straw, and then tried again. Earl and Tommy, who had just arrived, watched in breathless silence. With a great shuddering effort, Hobo pushed himself up. He stood there, swaying but upright, on his own 4 feet for the first time. A wave of pride, so fierce and profound it almost buckled his own knees, washed over Earl. He looked at Tommy, and the boy's face was a mirror of his own emotion, pure, unadulterated joy. It was more than a calf standing. It was hope, made tangible and real, right there in his dusty old barn. The wider world, however, had a way of creeping in. Earl's nephew, Gary, a practical man who ran a small insurance business in town, stopped by one weekend. He saw Hobo, now looking more like a proper calf, and did the quick math in his head. "Uncle Earl," he said, trying to sound helpful, "you're spending a fortune on milk replacer and feed for that thing. You know a bull calf with no papers, especially one that's been sick, won't bring anything at auction. You can't afford to keep him as a pet." Earl's jaw tightened. "He's not a pet, and he's not for auction." The conversation left a sour taste in his mouth, a reminder of the cold arithmetic that governed the world he had once been a part of. A few days later, while picking up supplies in town, he overheard 2 ranchers talking by the feed sacks. They were complaining about one of the big corporate feedlots 2 counties over, how they'd cut corners to save a buck. They spoke of how sick calves were, sometimes just loaded onto a truck and dumped on back roads at night to die, saving the company vet bills and disposal fees. The description: a small, mangy calf, left in a ditch, in the dead of winter, hit Earl like a physical blow. A cold, hard anger settled deep in his gut. Hobo hadn't just been lost or abandoned by his mother. He had been thrown away, discarded like a piece of trash by people who saw him not as a living creature, but as a debit on a ledger. At that moment, Earl's mission became crystal clear. This wasn't just about saving an animal anymore, it was about defiance. It was about proving that a life's worth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. That evening, as the sun cast long, golden rays through the barn door, Earl sat on an overturned bucket, watching Hobo. The calf, feeling stronger, walked over to him and nudged his leg. Earl reached out and absently stroked its neck, his mind turning over the day's events. The weight of his nephew's warning, the ugliness of the rancher's story, it all felt heavy. Just then, Hobo lifted his head and pressed it against Earl's chest. Then, he stretched out his neck and gave Earl's weathered, calloused hand a long, slow lick with his rough tongue. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but in the stillness of the barn, it felt like a sacred pact. It was a thank you. It was an act of complete and total trust. It was a promise, passed from a creature who had been shown no mercy to the man who had shown him nothing but. Earl felt a lump form in his throat. He looked down at the calf leaning against him and knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never let him down. Spring thawed the land, and with it, something thawed in Earl Jenkins. The change was most visible in Hobo. The once frail calf was beginning to fill out, his body losing its sharp, angular desperation and taking on the solid promise of a young bull. His coat, once a sad patchwork of bare skin and matted fur, was now growing in thick and glossy, a rich, deep brown that shone in the sunlight. He had a permanent home now, not in the small stall, but in the near pasture, the one that ran alongside the house. But before that could happen, the fence needed mending. It was a job Earl had put off for years. The fence had been Martha's pride, always straight and sturdy, but since her passing, it had sagged in places, a few posts leaning like weary old men. For 5 years, he hadn't had the heart to fix it, because fixing it meant admitting that life had to go on in those fields without her. But now, with Hobo testing his legs and needing more room, the fence wasn't a monument to the past. It was a necessity for the future. So Earl dug out the old post-hole digger, the wooden handles worn smooth by his own father's hands, and he got to work. The familiar ache in his back, the scent of fresh-turned earth, the rhythmic thud of the tamping bar. It was hard work, but it was good work. It was the kind of work that cleared a man's head and made him feel useful again. He was no longer just maintaining a property, he was rebuilding a home. Tommy was there for most of it, his shadow stretching long beside Earl's in the late afternoon sun. The boy was a quiet companion, but a good one. He'd hand Earl staples, help stretch the new wire, and listen. As they worked, Earl found himself talking more than he had in years. He told Tommy stories about the farm when it was a bustling dairy, about the cow that always managed to get out of the pasture no matter how high he built the fence, about the time he and Martha had stayed up all night to help a mother deliver twin calves. He spoke of his own youth, of learning to drive a tractor in that very field. The stories weren't just for Tommy, they were for him too. He was pulling memories out of dusty boxes and finding they weren't as painful as he'd feared. They were warm. One afternoon, they decided to build a new hay feeder for the pasture. The old one had rusted through. They salvaged wood from a collapsed shed, and Earl taught Tommy how to measure twice and cut once, how to drive a nail straight and true. As they worked, side by side, a bond formed between the old man who thought his life was over and the young boy who was just starting his. Hobo would watch them from a distance, his big, dark eyes curious and calm, a silent third partner in their small enterprise. The story of the ditch calf and the old farmer had become something of a local legend. People talked about it at the diner, at the post office. So it wasn't a complete surprise when a car pulled into Earl's driveway one day, and out stepped Clara Bellwether, the head of the county fair committee. She was a kind woman with a persuasive smile. "Earl," she began, getting straight to the point, "we're having our annual Farm Animals for the Kids Day at the fair next month. We want the children to see what real farm life is about, to connect with the animals. We were all wondering if you'd be willing to bring Hobo." Earl was taken aback. He was a private man. Hobo's recovery felt personal, a quiet victory not meant for public display. "Oh, I don't know, Clara," he mumbled, shifting his feet. "He's just a bull, nothing special." Clara's smile didn't waver. "From what I hear, He's very special. He's gentle. And he's a story of hope. That's something every child needs to see. Earl looked over at the pasture, where Hobo was peacefully grazing. And then he saw Tommy, who had been listening from the porch, his eyes wide with excitement. The thought of disappointing the boy was worse than the thought of facing a crowd. "All right, Clara," he said with a sigh. "We'll be there." The day of the fair was bright and noisy, a sensory overload for a man used to quiet fields. The air was thick with the smell of fried dough and livestock, but Hobo took it all in stride. He stood calmly in the pen they'd set up for him, his demeanor as gentle as a summer breeze. He wasn't a massive, intimidating bull. He was just a strong, healthy animal with a deep, soulful peacefulness about him. The children loved him. They'd reach their small hands through the fence, and Hobo would allow them to stroke his broad nose, his big eyes blinking slowly, patiently. He never flinched, never showed a moment of agitation. He just stood there, a symbol of gentle strength. Earl watched from the side, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He saw the wonder on the children's faces. He heard parents whispering Hobo's story to each other. This wasn't just his calf anymore. This was a living, breathing lesson in second chances. This was the proof that something discarded as worthless could, with a little care, become something beautiful. He saw Hobo not just as an animal he'd saved, but as a living reminder of what his wife, Martha, had always believed, that kindness was its own reward. The drive home was quiet. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Earl felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling of rightness he hadn't known in a long time. He pulled up to his mailbox at the end of the long driveway, just as he did every day. Inside, among the usual circulars, was a crisp, official-looking envelope from the county bank. He slid it open with his thumb, his eyes scanning the contents as the truck idled. The words were cold and impersonal. It was a final notice. Property taxes were overdue. The amount listed made his blood run cold. All the money he'd spent on vet bills, on feed, on medicine for Hobo, it had drained his meager savings far more than he had allowed himself to admit. He was short. Dangerously short. He drove the rest of the way to the house in a daze, the joyful sounds of the fair replaced by a roaring silence in his ears. Later that night, he sat at his old oak kitchen table. On one side lay the blue ribbon Hobo had been given at the fair, a bright splash of color symbolizing hope and triumph. On the other side lay the stark white paper from the bank, a demand that threatened to take everything away. He stared at the two objects, a chasm of an impossible choice opening up before him. He knew what the world would tell him to do. He knew what his nephew Gary would say. Sell the bull. It was the only logical thing. But as he looked at the ribbon, he saw Hobo's trusting eyes, and he felt the weight of a promise that went deeper than money. The bank notice on the kitchen table felt heavier than a block of granite. Its sharp, official corners seemed to mock the soft blue of Hobo's prize ribbon. For days, Earl tried to push it from his mind by throwing himself into work, the kind of hard, physical labor that used to solve problems. He spent a whole day in the dusty, cobweb-filled workshop, sorting through tools he hadn't touched in a decade. He loaded his truck with old plowshares, rusted lengths of chain, and a broken cultivator, pieces of his past he'd always meant to fix. The man at the scrapyard gave him a handful of crumpled bills that didn't amount to much more than a week's worth of feed. It was a drop in a very deep bucket. He sold a set of antique wrenches to a collector in the next town over, and the transaction left him feeling hollow, as if he'd sold off a piece of his own history for pocket change. Every dollar he scraped together felt like a victory and a defeat all at once. He was fighting, but he was losing ground. The deadline loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, and no amount of hard work was going to make it go away. One afternoon, a shiny new pickup truck, too clean for a farm road, pulled into his driveway. A man got out, a man Earl knew but hadn't spoken to in years. It was Gary Leland, a local cattle buyer who had a reputation for turning a fast profit. He had an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Heard you had a fine-looking young bull out here, Earl," Gary said. leaning against his truck and nodding toward the pasture where Hobo was grazing peacefully. "Heard right," Earl said, his voice flat. He didn't like Gary's manner, the way his eyes scanned Hobo like he was adding up numbers on a calculator. Gary walked over to the fence, making a show of appraising the animal. "He's filled out nice. Real nice. A lot of folks wouldn't have bothered with one that started out so rough." The compliment felt like a hook. "I've got a truck heading south next week," Gary continued, turning back to Earl. "Got an empty spot on it. I could take him off your hands, give you a good price. More than you'd get at the local auction, that's for sure. We can get some real use out of him." The phrase hung in the air, cold and sharp. Earl knew exactly what use Gary was talking about. It wasn't a life in a green pasture. It was a one-way trip to a feedlot, and then a processing plant. It was the final, brutal end for an animal whose only crime was being born. The offer Gary made was staggering. It was more than enough to pay the taxes, with plenty left over. It was the answer to his prayers, delivered by a man who felt like the devil. Earl didn't answer right away. He just stood there, the buyer's offer echoing in his ears, a tempting poison. As Gary finally drove away, leaving a cloud of dust behind, Earl saw a small figure emerge from the shadows of the barn door. It was Tommy. The boy's face was pale, his jaw set. He had heard everything. "You're not going to sell him, are you?" Tommy's voice was tight, accusing. Earl felt a fresh wave of weariness wash over him. "It's complicated, son." "No, it's not." The boy shot back, his own pain making his words sharp. "You're just going to give up on him. After everything. That's what people do. They say they care and then they just leave." The accusation hit Earl harder than any storm. He saw in Tommy's eyes the raw wound of his own father's loss, the deep-seated fear of being abandoned. The boy wasn't just talking about a bull. He was talking about himself. He was talking about promises, broken and kept. Tommy turned and ran, disappearing down the long driveway, leaving Earl standing alone with the weight of a choice that now felt impossibly heavy. He was trapped between saving his farm and breaking the heart of the two living beings who had come to trust him most. For 2 days, Earl was a ghost in his own home. He'd sit at the kitchen table staring at the phone, knowing he should call Gary, knowing he couldn't. The bank deadline was now just days away. The pressure was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. Then the storm hit. It rolled in from the west, fast and violent, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Earl was inside, watching the trees bend, when he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm. It was a bellow of pure pain and terror from the pasture. Hobo. Earl grabbed his coat and ran out into the deluge. The wind tore at him, and the rain soaked him to the bone in seconds. He found Hobo near the back fence line. A section of old brittle wire, snapped by a falling branch, had coiled around the bull's back leg. In his panic, Hobo had pulled and thrashed, drawing the wire tighter and tighter, slicing deep into his own flesh. It was a nightmare of tangled wire and panicked animal. It took Earl nearly half an hour of fighting the storm, the wire, and Hobo's fear to finally cut him free. He led the limping, bleeding animal back to the safety of the barn and immediately called Dr. Raymond. She arrived, her face grim as she worked under the dim barn lights. After she cleaned and stitched the wound, she delivered the final, devastating blow. "The wire cut deep, Earl," she said, her voice full of a gentle sorrow. "He's damaged the tendons badly. He'll live, but he'll always have that limp. He'll never walk right again." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. He was worthless now. In market terms, he was less than nothing. The one thing he could have been sold for was gone. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world washed clean and a heavy, dripping silence. Earl sat on a bale of hay in the quiet barn, the scent of rain and antiseptic filling the air. He listened to Hobo's labored, pained breathing. He felt a crushing, absolute sense of failure. He hadn't just failed to save his farm. He had failed to protect the creature he'd promised to save. He had failed the trust of a lonely little boy. In the quiet dark of his barn, Earl Jenkins felt like he had lost everything all over again. The hours that followed the storm were the longest of Earl's life. He didn't leave the barn. He just sat there on a hay bale, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a physical thing. The barn, which had become a place of hope, now felt like a tomb again, echoing with the sound of Hobo's pained breathing. Every ragged breath was a testament to his own shortcomings. He had brought this animal back from the brink of death, only to lead him to this new ruin. The logical part of his brain, the part that sounded a lot like his nephew Gary, told him it was over. The bull was lame, the bank was waiting, and he was just an old man who had tried and failed. He found himself thinking of Martha, and for the first time, the memory brought a sharp, bitter pang. He had tried to live up to her example, to her boundless capacity for care, and he had fallen short. Then, another one of her sayings surfaced from the deep well of his memory, as clear as if she were standing right beside him. "Earl," she had once told him after they'd lost a calf to a sudden illness, "worth isn't measured by what something brings at auction. It's measured by the love you give it while it's here." He looked over at Hobo, lying in the clean straw, his bandaged legs stretched out awkwardly. The animal turned his great head and looked at Earl, his eyes soft and full of a deep, unwavering trust. There was no blame in that gaze, no accusation. There was only a quiet connection that transcended injury and failure. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the dusty barn windows, a small figure appeared in the doorway. It was Tommy. The boy didn't say a word. He walked over and stood beside Earl, his eyes fixed on Hobo's bandaged leg. The anger from 2 days ago was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared sorrow. After a long moment of silence, Tommy held out his hand. In it was a small glass jar, the kind his mother used for canning peaches. It was filled with a mess of crumpled bills and a handful of coins. "It's my savings," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "From mowing lawns and helping Mr. Henderson stack wood. It's not much, but I want to help." Earl looked from the jar to the boy's earnest, worried face, and something inside him, a hard knot of pride and despair that had been clenched tight in his chest, finally broke. A tear, the first he'd shed since Martha's funeral, traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had been so focused on what he couldn't do, on what he had lost, that he had forgotten what he had found. He had found a boy with a heart as big as the open sky, a boy who understood that you don't abandon family when things get hard. He pulled Tommy into a rough, one-armed hug. "Thank you, son," he choked out. "That means more than you'll ever know." The boy's simple act of kindness was a spark, and it didn't take long for that spark to catch fire. Word travels fast in a small town, carried on currents of coffee shop gossip and telephone calls. The story of Hobo's injury, of Earl's struggle with the bank, and of Tommy's jar of savings spread through the community like a warm front. The next morning, Bill from the feed store showed up with a truckload of hay. "On the house, Earl," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You just focus on getting that bull back on his feet." Before long, other neighbors started to arrive. One brought a casserole, another a bag of feed supplements Dr. Raymond had recommended. A crew of younger farmers, men Earl had known since they were boys, showed up with tools and spent the entire day replacing the old, rotten sections of the pasture fence, making it safe and strong. By the end of the week, an envelope appeared in his mailbox. It was unmarked, but inside was a cashier's check for the exact amount of the overdue property taxes. Earl never found out who sent it, but he had a feeling it wasn't just one person. It was the whole town, chipping in, paying back a debt of kindness. They weren't just saving a farm, they were saving one of their own. With the pressure of the bank gone, Earl could pour all his energy into Hobo. The healing was a slow, painstaking process. Every day, Earl and Tommy would carefully change the bandages. Earl, using the gentle, patient hands of a lifelong stockman, would massage the muscles around the injury, coaxing life back into the damaged limb. They built a sling in the barn to help Hobo stand for short periods, taking the weight off his leg. It was a long, slow dance of patience and care. There were days of progress and days of setbacks, but neither Earl nor Tommy ever gave up. Slowly, steadily, the leg began to mend. The day came when Hobo took his first unaided steps. His gait was crooked, a permanent, rolling limp, but he was walking. He was a survivor. Months later, the sun shone down on the opening day parade of the annual county fair. And leading that parade wasn't the mayor or the high school marching band. It was an old farmer in his Sunday best, walking beside a big brown bull with a gentle limp. And beside them, holding the lead rope with a proud grin, was a 10-year-old boy. The crowd lining the street fell silent as they passed. When they reached the grandstand, Earl was handed a microphone. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his friends, the people who had rallied around him. "They say some things are broken beyond repair," he began, his voice clear and strong. "They say you should know when to cut your losses and walk away. But this bull here, this bull and this boy, they taught an old man that there's no such thing as worthless. They taught me that second chances are real, not just for a calf left in a ditch, but for old farms and for old men who thought they were done." Later that evening, as the golden light of the setting sun bathed the farm, Earl stood by the new fence, watching Hobo graze peacefully. Tommy stood beside him, his hand resting on the top rail, just as Martha's used to. The barn behind them was no longer a silent, empty space. It was full of life, full of hope, and full of the quiet promise of tomorrow. Earl knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his heart, just like his barn, would never be empty again.